Welcome to Inspired Men Talk, four solution-focused therapists born in 4 different decades who openly and honestly discuss their perspective on the issues surrounding men's mental health. The things that stigma says we don't talk about. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Inspired Men Talk. And this week we're going to start a series of podcasts where we break down different things that we suffer from in our brains. So we're going to start looking at today anxiety. And there's plenty of people in the world who suffer from anxiety, but do you understand what actually happens in our minds? Where does it come from? How do we create it? But then obviously, most importantly, what can we do about it? And as the series progresses, we're going to look at areas such as depression, maybe fears and phobias, and we'll see where we go as the sessions progress. So, anxiety. I personally have suffered from anxiety. So, I worked in the police and my workload reached a point where it became so bad that I was waking up every day with that dread that sits in your stomach. It's like a washing machine on spin cycle, and it's the inability to sit still. I used to twitch a lot. I used to move a lot, and I go through this cycle in my mind where I'd worry about what my day was going to be like, and then eventually I'd bring myself to get up and start moving. And once I got in the shower, it would subside and it would change, and it wouldn't be as bad as when I first opened my eyes. So, where does it come from and what does it do? Well, we create anxiety by negative thinking. So, every negative thought that we have in our lives that we create, and that can be something that ultimately we can negatively forecast the future or we can negatively introspect about the past. But when we start to worry, so i.e., like I did when I used to think, if I go to work, what emails are going to be there? What disasters am I going to have when I get into work? It could all go wrong. It's going to be a bad day. That starts to build my anxiety and in turn causes me to move from my intellectual brain, or what we know as our left prefrontal cortex, and move downstairs into our primitive and emotional mind. And when we're down there, we basically go into like survival mode. And our brain thinks that we're in some sort of crisis or emergency, and it's trying to step in and help us and to protect us. So for me, the way it did that was to try and stop me from getting out of bed. It used to make me want to stay there. It used to make me feel those bad feelings in my stomach. However, when I actually started moving physically, and I did have to tell myself a little bit to just get on with it, which is my intellectual brain upstairs trying to get a look in to say it's not that bad, it would change. So we can take control of how anxiety feels in our body and we can choose how we think and how we feel. And I'm going to get Gary to come in and explain a little bit more from the neuroscience perspective of why that happens.
It's really interesting of why we move from that part of the brain we call the intellectual brain, which is very rational, very logical. It will always come up with a proper assessment, whatever life throws at us, and we can generally cope. But what happens is, as stress, and we live in 2024, so there's lots of things throw stress at us. Now, the human brain can't tell the difference between stress of being chased by a wild animal or stress by, what we've got to, there's no milk for the cornflakes. So stress is stress. And if we get an overload of that stress and it's constant, so there's always something to play on our minds, worry us, concern us, something we have to do. But that continual build-up of stress, basic negative thinking, as you've said, we start moving into that primitive part, that limbic system, which is there to help us survive. Its sole purpose is self-preservation. And when we're in that part, it then actively looks for more problems. So it might be what takes somebody to that negative space is quite a big issue in their life. They might have a really challenging job. They might have a terrible relationship. But as we move into that space, it then notices anything that might be a minor problem, which we would normally cope with, and turns it into a bigger thing. So we then we play on that. And the brain then says, we're overwhelmed. We don't know what to do. And it only has 3 opt-out clauses to cope with that excessive level of stress. That's anxiety or depression or anger or a lovely old mix of all 3. And in your case, it was a level of anxiety. But what it then does is go, everything's dangerous. So how can I stop you walking out into a dangerous world? That's it. I'll make you feel like you need to stay in bed. So there's a lot of science around why we don't push through those boundaries, but it's all about perceived, it's all perception, because we know there's no wild animals roaming around the streets of most towns in the UK, but our brains will convince us that it does. And that primitive part of the brain was only 3 to 5 years old. It hasn't been updated for hundreds of thousands of years. It's irrational, illogical, and will always come up with the worst possible scenario for any given event. So it sees everything as a potential problem. And the best way of not getting into a mix of a problem is to avoid it. And that's what your brain was trying to get you to do. And I don't know if Peter or Christopher have ever been in this sort of space where their brain is coming up with all sorts of propaganda as why not to do something or go somewhere or be something.
Yeah, so very similar to Ben. I had issues with a really lovely client that I worked with, and it was really small things, just like, can you get me an extra staff member to come in and work next week? But as soon as their email pinged through, my heart rate would increase, and I'd always think that it would be some sort of crazy, outrageous request. My brain would go to this is going to be a really bad thing, and I'd avoid even opening the email. And eventually you have to open them because you start getting chased for them, and you'd open it up and it would be a simple request of, can you help me get an extra staff person for like 2 weeks time? But that fear that led into it led to avoidance for me, certainly. And then learning about what we do and how we do it and why these things happen to us just made so much sense to how I was coping with things back then, or not coping, as the case may be.
So Gary's on mute as always because we know he's useless at using his bloody microphone or his headphones. Gary, you put yourself back on mute, mate?
No, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm here. I'm here. One of the things is that logical part of your brain. You knew that you should answer the email, and you knew it wouldn't be a problem, but you didn't have control.
Yes.
You'd lost that control. Your primitive brain, which was trying to protect you, was going, yeah, it might be a big thing, might be a horrible thing. Don't do it, just in case. Even though intellectually you knew, but you didn't have the control, so you didn't do it.
Yeah. And it was funny because, I didn't work for the police force. I worked in a private security company. I wasn't saving lives. I wasn't on the front line as kind of Ben was. I always knew that it was going to be something small, because nothing that I really did was anything huge or major.
Not life-threatening.
Yeah, no, it really wasn't. This was a wealth management company, and there was never going to be anything huge there. But for me, those emails as they came through would send me into that fight or flight mode. It would send me into that perspective of this is danger. Something's going wrong, to the point where I had asked to be removed from that contract. It got to that bad.
Did that also make you a little bit more frustrated because you knew it wasn't real? So that frustration become anxiety in itself because you knew you was, just not doing what you needed to do.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I was very proud of myself in my job. I was very good in my job, and so to have that come up, it added to the fact that there was that thing that I wasn't doing, and then I was frustrated because I wasn't doing my job. So yeah, it definitely did.
I mean, you guys are talking about what happens actually in the brain when we're in these situations, and the fact that we call it the primitive brain. And I'd like to just kind of delve into that a little bit. So, why it's called the primitive brain is because it's the brain, like Gary said, that's been with us for hundreds of thousands of years. And it's basically what we use to survive as cavemen and cave women. You know, these threats that we would have faced back then would have created this anxiety. And anxiety really is just a way of increasing our strength and increasing our ability to protect ourselves against wild animals and other wild tribesmen. And although we don't have to go out and do that now, that is still hardwired into us. So when we do get an email from somebody that we may worry about, or we get a bill that we can't afford, we still drop into that primitive part of our brain. And there's a lot to be said about the physiology of about that part of the brain. And would any of you guys like to add into that?
So I think for me, and I know we're talking about how it's small things and a bit of what Peter touched on. Generally, the emails and the stress was small, but some days that stress came to real life. Those emails were big. The event was big. And what I found is that actually that would be the thing that would overwhelm me even more, because that was kind of the point where it was confirmation that it was going to be a bad day, and what I'd predicted happened. And therefore, it kind of adds to that negativity, to the pot of the fact that it is a stressful environment, it is going to be bad, and it is challenging. And, if you come into an email and says, oh, we've got some intel that someone's going to be shocked today, and you go, great, where do I start with that? Because I'm already struggling to function today. And it's how do I build my resilience to cope? Because it's not big things every day, but I'm perceiving that it's going to be. And sometimes that does come to reality. So it's how do I change that, I think, is probably what most people experience.
It's really interesting because what you're talking about is what most people seek, and it's quite a buzzword right now, and over the last couple of years, which is the term resilience. But resilience comes from you having the intellectual capacity to make a proper assessment of what's going on. But you can only do that when you're in that part of your brain which allows you to do that. Those left prefrontal cortex are in control, and they stop primitive messages of survival which are unnecessary in that moment to come through. They have a look at it and make a proper assessment. Is this really a problem, or is it not? And that's what that primitive part of the brain will insist on and push through if we're moving into that excessive level of stress. So if you go back through your career, any of you back through your lives, there are times when big things happened, which weren't nice, unpleasant things, but you was able to cope with it better. And you go, wow, cope with that. And then another time, something not nearly as big, but still maybe big, and you haven't been able to cope with it. And weirdly, it's not the big things necessarily what caused the overwhelm. It's the capacity you had before you got that big thing happening. And that's where resilience lies, in that middle. Because if at that moment you'd been in your intellectual brain, you would be able to go, okay, what's the proper assessment? What do I need to do? What's the solution here? When you're in the primitive part of the brain, because you've had lots of those little pebbles dropping in, filling up that capacity, when the big thing comes in, there's no capacity for it. And then you go, oh my God, I can only deal with this from a problem issue, and I haven't got the resources available to deal with it. So I'm now going to go into a state of anxiety, a state of panic, a state of avoidance. So
and that's true. That's because I used to revel. I used to love going to big problems. When the wheels come off, I used to love pulling up into absolute chaos and sorting out the disaster that's in front of you.
Yeah.
And I used to really enjoy it because you get out and you start moving stuff and you start changing stuff and you'd be the calm that came to the storm.
Mhm.
But somewhere, almost when I wasn't looking, a day appeared where that was flipped on its head. And all of a sudden, I didn't want to do any of that.
Well, one of the big things there is, I was watching a video by a quite a famous neurobiologist, and he was talking about when you make a big decision. So he was talking about somebody, there was a riot going on. It was in America. So this guy had a gun, and then somebody come running at him. And because he was scared and the guy was waving around this thing in his hand, he shot him because he thought he had a gun, which actually turned out to be a phone. But he said, but what you've got to look at was what was happening in that person's life who had the gun a couple of hours before. And if you're particularly going through a stressful part of your life, so you might be having a home issue before you go into that space, you might be having this issue, that issue, you're more likely to make completely the wrong judgment. Okay. And if you go back months and there's been stuff going on, filling up that capacity, when you're in that position to make a decision, you can't make a decision because that prefrontal area, which we call the intellectual brain, becomes sluggish. It doesn't take on that level of, let's assume what's going on here, make a proper assessment. It doesn't get involved because we're so overwhelmed. So you make the bad decision. And if you can't make a decision, you go into anxiety and avoidance, or both.
Mm. So I think thankfully, I have the appetite. More I'm talking about it now, my appetite to go back into that big situation is there because I've
Yeah.
managed to get my capacity back in my space where I can cope with stuff again. And I'm the one thing that changed the way I did that and got me back to where I was actually learning to become a therapist. Because it suddenly somebody explained to me what's going on, but also how simple it is to change what's going on. And I think that's the crucial part. We don't talk about how it works, our mind. But reality is that once you understand it, it's like learning to drive the car, go have therapy. I'm going to say biasly with solution focused therapist, i.e. hypnotherapist, like we are, because then together you can practice the techniques that you're given, and most importantly, emptying the stress that you've accumulated in what we would say is your stress bucket, through a really simple process. But most importantly for me, a process that didn't require us to dredge over the past or talk through all the negative, which was a big relief for me because I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to go through it. Pete, can you explain to everyone why that's important from us? Why is it we use that model, and what's the potential downfall of going through the past?
Yeah, of course. Well, you mentioned about your stress bucket there, and when we talk about stuff that goes on in our past and we relive our past, we actually fill up our stress again. So I don't know if you've ever had the situation where you're talking to someone about something that's gone on and you get the feelings that you had originally from when you went through that experience. Now, if you've gone through that, that's because your brain can't tell the difference between reality and imagination. And so by not focusing on the past, by not focusing on the negatives, you don't have to relive that. You don't fill up your stress bucket. Focusing on your future and what you want to do helps you to empty that stress bucket. So my kind of example from my life was that my coping mechanism for everything was alcohol. And I used to drink, and then I would get stuck in the brain thoughts of all of the stuff that had gone on in my day. And it would just make me feel worse and worse and worse. And then I'd start to drink. And then I'd think more about the negative. And I'd go through this downward negative spiral. So the whole solution focus method actually changes that from being a downward spiral into an upward spiral by not thinking about the negative stuff, by helping you to focus more on the positive aspects on your life. And we all have them. It might just be something really small to start with. It might be a good night's sleep, a seat on the tube You know, that used to always cheer me up, getting a seat on the tube. So it can be really small things that make you feel that your day has had a little positive thing that can help you to start to see more and more positives. Because like Gary said, your limbic system starts with the big scary thing and then sees everything as a negative. So if you can change that round, then you start to see your positives, and your limbic system works in the same way. You start to see everything in a positive way.
It's interesting because obviously I'm very close to Christopher, and he went through a bad time. How easy was that, or difficult was that for you to focus, Christopher, on those small good things to start creating capacity rather than revivifying the negatives what went on in your life?
Yeah, you know, at first it is really difficult. And I certainly found myself when I was trying to find those good things, they were always about other people, you know, and which is still okay. You know, we have those that are close to us, and you can celebrate those good things for those people. But it took me a while to be able to start actually recognizing and really appreciating all the positives that were going on in my life. And it does start, like Peter said, it starts with something really, really small. It can be absolutely anything. But once you do, it really does start changing the perspective on everything. You know, even though you've got those big scary things that are still going to be there, you know, they're not going to go away, and none of us are trying to pretend that they are. But it's where you draw that attention. You know, it's where that focus lies. And if you really do create and find those positive things, you create more positive things. You know, it's not only that you start seeing more, you start creating more as well, because your brain's already ready and active to look for the next one. Therefore, it will find the next one by making the next one. You know, it all comes to one, where you start that one positive, that one finding the seat on the tube, or, you know what, I had a really cracking bacon sandwich yesterday, you know, whatever it might be. When your brain's actively in that space, your life then starts becoming in that space, and it really does transform that. And it is a slow start. I know when I was there, at first you start finding those little things, and those big things still outweigh those little things, but you know, you keep pushing through with it, and it does really make a massive difference and makes a massive transformation. I think we need to talk a little bit before we wrap up, though, on, because we've spoken a lot about how we can be in that primitive part of our brain, be there, and we've started now talking a little bit about finding the positives, and it's how do we keep that intellectual control? I think it's really important that we talk about that, how we not only find those positives to be there, but how else do we keep our stress bucket down and stay in that positive frame of mind? What can our listeners do? What can you actually do, and what happens in the brain when we're there? You know, I think we need to just talk a bit about that before we wrap up.
How do we do it then, Chris?
Passing on to me. Fine.
Nice try, mate. But you know, you're talking about it, it's coming right back at your door.
Fair enough. No, so okay. So one of the things we have spoken about a lot is the stress bucket. You know, we've all said on all capacity, however you want to look at it, that part in our brain that stores all the stressful, little, big, everything like that goes on. And we all have that every day. Things will go in your stress bucket. But we do have a fantastic way as human beings of emptying that out. And it's during our sleep. And I don't know, most of you may have heard of REM sleep. That stands for rapid eye movement. And that's when we process things through the day. And that's where we empty our stress bucket. Okay. So if we've got the normal level of stuff that's in our stress bucket, we'll wake up the next day and that will be filtered out, and we'll be feeling better about those little things that bothered us the day before. But if we're putting loads and loads in that stress bucket, we can't have enough REM sleep to empty that. We only get about 10% of our sleep patterns are REM sleep. So that's not enough if we've got a massive amount in our stress bucket.
20%.
Okay. So where should I pick up from?
Go from the top.
So sleep. So when we sleep at night.
Oh yeah, if you said rapid eye movement sleep. So then just leave a pause and then come back in from when you said rapid eye movement sleep and then continue explaining what it was.
So it's really important, and it helps us empty our bucket.
So yeah, and that's really important. That rapid eye movement sleep is really important at emptying that bucket throughout that we've put stuff in throughout the day. Sadly, though, REM sleep is restricted to about 20% of our sleep patterns. And if we put loads and loads and loads, and loads of stuff in our bucket, then that's not enough to empty it. Okay, so we'll wake up the next day with stuff still in our bucket, and then we'll put more stuff in top of that, and then we won't get enough REM sleep the next night, and it's just a vicious circle. So what we need to do is basically restrict the amount of stuff going into that bucket. And like we've already mentioned, the best way to do that is by positive thinking. Okay.
I'll tell my clients to put a lid on their bucket. I say change your open waste paper bin from being that style and change it to a pedal bin. It's permanently shut and it only opens when you press the button to open it to put something in. Because we can go through life, and yeah, okay, we can't sit here and say that every single day in your life the sun's going to shine and you're going to get out with a smile on your face and it's going to be amazing and we're never going to put anything in that bucket. But by changing that dynamic, making it that pedal bin, not everything goes inside. So that then when they have their REM sleep and we're getting our 20%, we are taking out maybe one or two things, but we're maybe only putting one back in. And slowly over that process, if you stick to it, we increase your capacity to cope. And most importantly, some people will have maybe some rocks stuck at the bottom. So you imagine that bucket of water and then it's full to the top and I chuck in some big heavy rocks. Now they're covered in slime and I tell you to try pull them out, but no matter how hard you try, you can't lift them back out of the bucket. So we leave them in there and we just cover them up with day-to-day life. So when we start sticking to this process, eventually we will uncover them. And then slowly but surely, we'll take those rocks out one by one. And that doesn't mean that we have to go back through the minute detail. We might not even ever have to talk, cover that subject at all. You might not even think about it. It might just take it out as part of the natural process of REM. But so then my question comes in, how do we teach our clients then to keep that positive groove going? What do we do to keep it going bit by bit each day to keep them in their positive mind?
So for me, it's a simple and becomes an easier process because it's about neuroplasticity, which is not a simple topic, but it's basically getting us habitually almost looking at what's been good. And again, when I ask somebody who doesn't know the whole process, they've just started working with me and I go, what's been good? And they're looking for, something huge. And it's like, no, what did you have for dinner? Did you have a nice cup of coffee? Did you get a seat on the tube? And every time you do that, you release a little bit of serotonin, a little bit of dopamine, a little bit of oxytocin, whenever you have any of those positive thoughts.
What are they, Gary?
Well, they're neurochemicals, so they're either hormones or neurochemicals. And like if you take antidepressants to help you benefit more from the serotonin you have, but if you're making more, they're going to be more beneficial. So the more you have positive interaction, which will release oxytocin, the more you have positive thoughts, you're going to generate more serotonin, and the more you have positive action. And you talked earlier, Ben, about getting up and going for a shower. That small action produced dopamine and helped you then cope better with the anxiety. Now, when we started this, and Christopher's been through it as well, I had an IT issue. My microphone wasn't working, my headphones, and they all picked
Let's
on
just
me.
be clear, it's not just once, is it? It's like every time we sit
Right,
down.
every time we sit down, and then I was on mute. And guess what? That was all negative, and it all went in my bucket. I mean, these guys don't care; they put stuff in my bucket, but I've got nothing else in the bucket. I don't wake up in the morning with any level of anxiety or depression or dread or anger. And stuff goes in my bucket. Of course it does, mostly little tiny things like that. But tonight, my REM will empty that. because I've got to that place where life happens and then I process it at night. So the tip is getting really thinking about what is it that I'm doing. And the number one tip is movement. And people go on about exercise. Most people, not everyone, but many people are completely uncomfortable, intimidated almost by going to places like gyms, but actually just moving a bit quicker, walking a bit quicker, doing the housework a bit harder, parking further from the store will give you that little bit of movement. So it's not necessarily exercise, but it's activity. But doing hobbies, what you enjoy, things, because our brain will try and stop us doing things. So it's just stepping out, but not out of our comfort zone so it feels uncomfortable, but just pushing it and noticing, taking half a second to notice something pleasant, something nice, something to put a smile on your face.
With you calling it REM, all I've got is Everybody Hurts going around my head now.
I've got shiny, happy people.
Yeah. So I mean, we know the sleep term came first, but what a great name, because you can't get away from it. But the younger people, unlike you people, won't know who they are. I've actually used that joke on a couple of people, clients, and they're like, who? And it's just like, oh yeah, you're too young.
Yeah, don't worry.
So we follow 3 simple steps, don't we, guys? What are those steps, Pete? Oh, in fact, I'm going to get you, Pete, Chris, and Gary. You can give us the 3 Ps. So, Pete, kick it off from the top.
Okay, so for me, the first one is positive thoughts, and be really happy about my positive thoughts about getting my seat on the tube.
Cool. Chris?
Mine is going to have to be positive actions. So doing positive things so you can think about those positive things.
What's an action you can give us, Chris?
So an action, maybe just getting up and having that shower, like you spoke about. That is a positive action, stepping in the right direction.
Yeah.
Final one, Gaza.
Positive interaction, which sometimes, depending on your peer group, so I really struggled doing the podcast to get positive interaction. But positive interaction, where you do laugh, where you do enjoy, they talk about, in old-fashioned money, they talk about energy vampires and energy angels. So find those energy people after you've had a chat with them about anything, even somebody you've met on the tube, who, when you finish a conversation, you feel better than when you left it. It produces oxytocin. So any positive, ring your mum, ring your sister, ring your mate, just interact in any way will generate positive chemicals. And while you're producing those positive chemicals from positive interaction, positive action, positive thought, you can't be putting stuff in your bucket. So that enables your bucket to do its natural emptying without you filling it up. And I think the last thing I want to say is the number one thing which a lot of people struggle with is dwelling on the past, recycling negative memories. So actually, if you find yourself doing that, think, actually, what tune, when it comes on the radio, whether it's REM or whether it's any other music,
not everybody has, though.
No, what do I have? What music can I not resist tapping to? Or what's the music, when I hear it, I'm always the first on the dance floor? Or what's my favorite holiday? Who's my favorite thing? When I think about it, do I just feel good? So you've got some alternative choices of thought if you find yourself negatively reminiscing about things you can't do anything about.
Oof. What's your favourite song, Pete, that you bop to?
I've said this once and I've said it a million times. It's Katrina and the Waves, Walking on Sunshine. Always makes me jump out of bed. Always makes me dance. Love it.
Chris, you got a favourite tune?
If I need to get on and do something, I always stick a Green Day playlist on. That's me.
Green Day.
Stick a Green Day playlist, and it makes me shout and dance and move around.
Nice.
So I'm an old-fashioned rocker, so it's normally AC/DC. Which is probably, some of the titles don't really go with what we're talking about, but they really get you going. Or I'm also a big Leicester Tigers rugby fan, and they play Deep Purple, Smoke on the Water, so you can't help doing it. Well, of course, Rocky, the Eye of the Tiger. It makes you feel like you can take anybody on. But we've all got those songs.
Well, I'm on Higher Love at the minute by Kygo and Whitney Houston.
Yeah.
And it's definitely one that gets me going at the minute.
Yeah. And those things, they just change your state, don't they? You feel more capable in that moment. And those simple actions can be a difference between you having a good day and a bad day. And those simple actions can change you from having a mental health issue to actually feeling like you're in control of your life.
Excellent. So, guys, we're going to summarize this and we're all going to take a part of it to finish this podcast off. So, remember, if you're suffering from anxiety, you've got that feeling, that washing machine stomach. It's not because you're broken. It's not because you're a bad person. It's quite simply that you've probably been piling a little bit too much in your stress bucket. And sometimes that happens without you even noticing it. It's just a series of small events that occur in your life, personal, work, whatever it's going to be, that tip you over that boiling point a little bit. Just your bucket overflows. So what is our steps that we can take as a quick reminder for the ladies and gents who are listening on how to deal with it? Pete, coming to you first.
So make sure that you get a good night's sleep. Try and maximize your REM sleep and have a good sleep routine. That's number one from me.
Chris?
Yeah, it's remembering that, we've spoken a lot about this, finding the positives, but it is really, really looking for those. At first, it may seem hard, but finding those positive things to be positive about and keep them in mind. Write them down if you have to. That's a big one for me, because when you write them down, it cements that positive thought in a lot more. So writing down those positive things, that is one of the biggest tips I can give to anybody.
And finally, try not to talk for too much, Gary, because it is the end. But what's the final step from you?
Talking to someone about
you see that gesture?
Positive. So it could be ringing up your mum and just talking about something nice. It could be finding somebody a tiresome job you're doing and finding someone and have a nice cup of coffee with them. So there's something positive in your job.
Awesome. Thanks again for listening, everybody, and hope you enjoyed this shorter series on how the brain works, and there's more to come as we progress. Take care and speak to you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye
Goodbye, everybody. Have a fantastic week. Thank you for listening to the podcast that proves men do talk.
If you would like more information or support, then please visit inspiredtochange.biz,
where you can learn more about us and the Inspired to Change team.
And remember, the conversation continues on our social media at Inspired Men Talk.